Sarah Martinez had perfected the art of
Captain,
hiding in plain
I
sight. Every morning, she carefully
Clock.
rolled down the sleeves
This
of her
confirms the
crisp,
timeline.
white
The
button-down
entry
shirt,
point is here.
ensuring that
We move at
not even
dawn.
a hint of ink showed beneath the fabric. The corporate office of Henderson
We've
and
got movement in
Associates
Sector
buzzed around
3.
her as she settled into
Prepare
her
for
desk,
extraction.
the familiar hum of printers and hushed phone conversations creating a backdrop she had grown comfortable with over the past 3 years. Her colleagues knew her as the quiet accountant in the corner cubicle, the one who always wore long sleeves regardless of the weather. Even during the sweltering summer months, when the air conditioning struggled to keep up, Sarah never once rolled up her sleeves. When curious coworkers asked about her preference for covered arms, she would simply smile and mention her sensitivity to the office's cold air conditioning. The truth was far more complicated than anyone could imagine. Beneath the conservative fabric lay an intricate sleeve tattoo that told a story few people in the world would understand. The design wasn't just artistic expression or rebellious youth indiscretion. Every line, every symbol, every carefully shaded detail represented something that could change everything about her carefully constructed life. Sarah had learned to compartmentalize her existence with surgical precision. During business hours, she was the reliable number cruncher who never missed a deadline and rarely spoke unless spoken to. Her apartment was modest, her car unremarkable, and her social media presence practically non-existent. She had become a master of being forgettable, and that was exactly how she needed things to stay. The tattoo had been completed 7 years earlier, in a small parlor tucked away in the back streets of Prague. The artist, an old man with weathered hands and knowing eyes, had worked in complete silence for hours. He never asked questions about the symbols Sarah brought him on a crumpled piece of paper, and she never offered explanations. Some conversations were better left unspoken. Now, as she processed invoices and reconciled accounts, Sarah occasionally caught herself unconsciously rubbing her left forearm through the fabric. The habit had developed during her first year at Henderson and Associates, a nervous tic that surfaced whenever she felt exposed or vulnerable. Her supervisor, Janet Morrison, had noticed it once during a particularly stressful audit season. "Everything all right, Sarah?" Janet had asked with genuine concern. "You seem tense lately." "Just the usual end-of-quarter stress," Sarah had replied, forcing her hand away from her arm and back to the keyboard. "Nothing that won't be resolved once these reports are finished." Janet had accepted the explanation without further questioning, but Sarah noticed the way her supervisor's eyes lingered on her movements for the rest of that week. It was a reminder that even the smallest habits could draw unwanted attention, and attention was something Sarah couldn't afford. The morning routine continued as it had for over 1,000 days. Coffee from the break room, check emails, review the daily task list, and begin the methodical process of managing numbers that represented other people's money and decisions. It was honest work, if somewhat mundane, and it provided exactly what Sarah needed: stability, predictability, and invisibility. Her cubicle was strategically positioned near the back corner of the office, offering her clear sight lines to all entrances while keeping her back protected by the wall. Most people would dismiss such positioning as coincidence or simple preference, but Sarah's choices were never random. She had learned long ago that survival often depended on the smallest details that others overlooked. The tattoo beneath her sleeve contained symbols that would be meaningless to most observers. To the casual eye, it might appear to be an abstract artistic design, perhaps inspired by geometric patterns or tribal artwork. But hidden within the intricate lines and carefully placed symbols was a story that connected her to a world she had tried desperately to leave behind. Sarah's past wasn't something she discussed with anyone, including the few casual friends she had made since moving to the city. When pressed about her background during rare social conversations, she would mention growing up in the Midwest, attending a state university, and finding her way into accounting through a series of practical career decisions. None of it was technically false, but the gaps between those facts contained enough classified information to fill several thick files. The transition from her previous life to her current existence had taken careful planning and considerable sacrifice. She had abandoned relationships, changed her appearance, and learned to suppress instincts that had once kept her alive in far more dangerous circumstances. The corporate world operated by different rules, and Sarah had spent 3 years learning to navigate office politics instead of international intelligence networks. Her computer screen displayed rows of financial data that required her attention, but Sarah found herself momentarily distracted by the sound of unfamiliar voices in the hallway outside her department. Henderson and Associates occasionally brought in consultants for specialized projects, so new faces weren't entirely unusual. However, something about the cadence of the conversation triggered an alertness that Sarah had worked hard to suppress. She forced herself to focus on the spreadsheet in front of her, calculating commission percentages for the sales team's quarterly bonuses. The work required concentration, which helped quiet the part of her mind that remained perpetually vigilant for threats that likely didn't exist in her current environment. During lunch break, Sarah typically ate alone at her desk while reading financial journals or industry publications. The habit kept her informed about her chosen field while avoiding the complicated social dynamics that came with group meals in the break room. Today, however, she found herself listening to fragments of conversation from nearby cubicles. New security audit, someone was saying. Government contract, apparently. Pretty comprehensive review of our client files and personnel records. Sarah's hand instinctively moved toward her left arm before she caught herself and redirected the motion to reach for her coffee cup. Security audits were routine in many businesses, particularly those that handled sensitive financial information. There was no reason to assume this particular review had anything to do with her or her carefully buried past. Still, the news stirred something uncomfortable in her chest. She had chosen Henderson and Associates partly because of its domestic client base and straightforward business model. The company primarily handled accounting services for mid-sized regional businesses, staying well clear of the international contracts and government connections that might attract the wrong kind of attention. The afternoon passed without incident, though Sarah found herself more aware than usual of the movements and conversations around her office. She completed her assigned tasks efficiently, responded to emails with professional courtesy, and maintained the pleasant but unremarkable demeanor that had served her well for 3 years. As 5 o'clock approached, Sarah began the process of securing her workstation for the evening. She cleared her desk of any sensitive documents, locked her computer, and gathered the minimal personal items she kept in her workspace. The routine was identical every day, reflecting habits that went far deeper than simple organizational preferences. The elevator ride to the parking garage was quiet, shared only with Tom Chun from the IT department, who nodded politely before returning his attention to his smartphone. Sarah's car, a 5-year-old sedan in an unremarkable shade of gray, waited in the same spot she had claimed on her first day of employment. The parking space offered easy access to multiple exit routes, though she told herself such considerations were merely remnants of old habits rather than current necessities. During the drive home, Sarah allowed herself to relax slightly. The radio played soft jazz that helped ease the low-level tension she carried throughout each workday. Her apartment was only 15 minutes from the office, located in a quiet complex that attracted young professionals and retirees who valued privacy and security. The evening routine was as carefully structured as her workplace habits. Dinner was simple but nutritious, prepared from ingredients that required minimal shopping trips, and left no distinctive patterns for anyone who might be observing her lifestyle. She read for an hour, usually fiction that transported her away from both her current reality and her complex past. Before bed, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror and carefully rolled up her left sleeve. The tattoo emerged like a secret revealed only to herself, the intricate design covering her arm from wrist to shoulder in flowing patterns that seemed to move in the soft lighting. She traced some of the symbols with her fingertip, remembering the weight of decisions that had led to their permanent placement on her skin. The largest symbol, positioned near her shoulder, was particularly meaningful. To most observers, it would appear to be an artistic interpretation of interlocking geometric shapes. But Sarah knew it represented something far more specific, a unit designation that connected her to operations she could never discuss and people she could never contact again. She had been young when she first earned the right to wear that symbol, barely out of college, and convinced she could change the world through intelligence work and covert operations. The idealism had faded over the years, replaced by a more pragmatic understanding of how governments and conflicts actually functioned. The decision to leave that world behind had been difficult, but necessary for reasons she rarely allowed herself to remember in detail. Rolling her sleeve back down, Sarah completed her evening preparations and settled into bed. Tomorrow would bring another day of financial reports and routine office interactions. The tattoo would remain hidden beneath professional attire, and her past would stay safely buried in classified files that most people would never see. As sleep approached, Sarah's mind began to quiet the hypervigilance that never fully disappeared. She had built a good life for herself, one that offered security and peace even if it sometimes felt empty compared to the intensity of her previous existence. The trade-off had been worth making, and she reminded herself of that fact whenever memories of her former life threatened to surface. The tattoo beneath her sleeve represented a chapter that had ended, replaced by the careful anonymity of corporate accounting and suburban routine. Sarah had successfully reinvented herself, and she intended to maintain that transformation regardless of whatever security audits or government contracts might briefly intersect with her deliberately ordinary world. The security audit began on a Tuesday morning with the arrival of three individuals who looked distinctly different from the usual parade of consultants and auditors that occasionally visited Henderson and Associates. Sarah noticed them immediately as they passed through the main entrance, their movements precise, and their eyes scanning the environment with the kind of systematic attention that most civilians never developed. From her corner cubicle, Sarah watched as Janet Morrison greeted the team in the reception area. The lead auditor, a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and a charcoal business suit, carried herself with an authority that suggested extensive experience in high-stakes situations. Her two companions, both men who appeared to be in their 30s, flanked her position while maintaining subtle but constant awareness of their surroundings. Sarah forced herself to focus on her computer screen as the group moved past her department toward the conference room where their initial briefing would take place. She had work to complete, deadlines to meet, and no legitimate reason to pay special attention to routine security procedures that affected the entire company. But the part of her mind that never fully relaxed had already begun analyzing details that would escape most observers. The lead auditor's shoes were practical rather than fashionable, designed for comfort during long periods of standing and walking. One of the men carried a briefcase that appeared heavier than typical business documents would require. Their clothing, while professional, had the subtle wrinkle-resistant properties that suggested frequent travel and extended wear. These observations accumulated in Sarah's consciousness despite her efforts to dismiss them as meaningless remnants of old habits. She had spent years learning to read people and situations for signs of danger or deception, and those skills proved difficult to completely suppress even in the mundane environment of corporate accounting. The morning passed with unusual tension throughout the office as word of the comprehensive audit spread among the staff. Conversations were more subdued than usual, and several colleagues made nervous jokes about the thoroughness of government oversight. Sarah participated in these discussions only when directly addressed, offering bland reassurances about the routine nature of such reviews. During her lunch break, Sarah overheard portions of a conversation between two managers discussing the scope of the audit. The government contract Henderson and Associates had recently secured apparently involved handling financial services for several federal agencies, requiring enhanced security clearances and extensive background verification for employees with access to sensitive information. The information made Sarah's coffee taste bitter as implications began forming in her mind. Enhanced security clearances meant detailed background investigations that could potentially uncover inconsistencies in her carefully constructed identity. While her cover story was solid and supported by legitimate documentation, any thorough investigation carried risks when the subject had a classified past. Sarah returned to her desk and immediately began reviewing her personnel file mentally, considering what information the company possessed about her background and employment history. She had been careful during the application process 3 years earlier, providing references who would support her cover identity and ensuring that her academic records aligned with her claimed background. The afternoon brought an unexpected development when Janet Morrison approached Sarah's cubicle with a clipboard and an apologetic expression. "Sarah, I need you to fill out some additional forms for the security audit," Janet said, placing several documents on the desk. It's just routine paperwork, but they need updated information from all employees who handle client financial data. Sarah accepted the forms with what she hoped appeared to be casual compliance. Of course. Is there a deadline for completion? End of the week would be perfect, Janet replied. And they mentioned they might need to conduct brief individual interviews with some staff members. Nothing to worry about, just standard procedure for this type of review. After Janet left, Sarah examined the forms carefully. Most of the requested information was standard: employment history, educational background, professional references, and emergency contacts. However, several questions went beyond typical HR documentation, asking for details about foreign travel, international contacts, and any previous government employment or security clearances. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously toward her left arm as she considered how to complete the forms without raising suspicions. The questions about foreign travel were particularly problematic, as her legitimate passport showed several trips to countries that might attract additional scrutiny if cross-referenced with classified travel records from her previous life. She decided to complete the forms honestly, but selectively, reporting only personal travel that could be easily verified through commercial records while omitting any journeys that had been conducted under official cover. The strategy carried risks, but inconsistencies between her current statements and any background investigation would be far more dangerous than selective disclosure. The rest of the week proceeded with increasing tension as the audit team established themselves in the conference room and began their systematic review of company records and procedures. Sarah observed their routine from a distance, noting the methodical approach they took to examining financial systems, personnel files, and security protocols. On Thursday afternoon, Sarah received an email requesting her presence in the conference room Friday morning for a brief interview as part of the audit process. The message was professional and routine, but Sarah spent most of Thursday evening preparing for questions that might probe beyond her carefully maintained cover story. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable humidity that made Sarah's long-sleeved blouse cling uncomfortably to her skin. She had chosen her outfit carefully, selecting professional attire that projected competence and reliability while ensuring complete coverage of her tattoo. The fabric felt heavier than usual as she made her way to the conference room. The lead auditor, who introduced herself as Director Patricia Wells, gestured for Sarah to take a seat across from the conference table. Her two colleagues remained standing near the window, their positions offering clear views of both the hallway and the conference room interior. Ms. Martinez, thank you for taking the time to meet with us, Director Wells began, consulting a thick folder that Sarah assumed contained her personnel information. This is just a routine interview to verify some details about your background and current responsibilities here at Henderson & Associates. Sarah nodded politely, keeping her hands folded in her lap to prevent any nervous gestures that might draw attention. I'm happy to help with your review. The initial questions were exactly what Sarah had expected: clarification about her job duties, length of employment, and general satisfaction with her position. Director Wells maintained a professional demeanor throughout, making notes on a legal pad while occasionally consulting the folder. I notice you attended State University in Michigan, Director Wells said, looking up from her notes. Can you tell me about your decision to pursue accounting as a career path? Sarah provided the rehearsed explanation she had used countless times over the past 3 years, emphasizing her aptitude for mathematics and appreciation for structured problem solving. The answer was true enough, even if it omitted the more complex motivations that had led to her career change. And your employment history shows a gap of several months between graduation and your first accounting position, Director Wells continued. Can you explain what you were doing during that period? This was territory Sarah had prepared for carefully. I spent some time traveling in Europe after graduation, she replied. It seemed like a good opportunity to see the world before settling into a career. I did some temporary work to fund the travel, mostly hospitality and service industry jobs that didn't require long-term commitments. Director Wells made additional notes, and Sarah noticed one of the men near the window shift his position slightly. The movement was subtle, but it suggested increased attention to her responses. Did you visit any particular countries during your European travel? Director Wells asked. Sarah had anticipated this question and prepared a truthful but incomplete answer. Primarily Western Europe. France, Germany, Italy, and the Czech Republic. I was interested in art and history, so I focused on countries with strong cultural attractions. The mention of the Czech Republic caused Director Wells to pause briefly in her note-taking. Sarah forced herself to maintain steady eye contact while internally reviewing her cover story for any potential weaknesses related to her time in Prague. That sounds like an enriching experience, Director Wells said after a moment. Did you have any significant international contacts or relationships during your travels? Nothing beyond casual friendships with other travelers, Sarah replied. I stayed in hostels and used budget tours, so most of my interactions were with people in similar situations. The interview continued for another 15 minutes, covering topics ranging from Sarah's current living situation to her professional goals and interests. Throughout the conversation, Sarah maintained the personality she had cultivated at Henderson and Associates. Competent but unremarkable, friendly but private, ambitious within reasonable bounds. As the interview concluded, Director Wells gathered her notes and closed the folder containing Sarah's information. Thank you for your time, Ms. Martinez. We may have some follow-up questions as we complete our review, but you've been very helpful. Sarah returned to her cubicle with a sense of cautious relief. The interview had proceeded without any obvious complications, and her responses had remained consistent with her established cover story. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that Director Wells had been evaluating more than just her suitability for handling sensitive financial information. The remainder of Friday passed quietly as Sarah focused on completing her weekly reports and preparing for the following week's projects. The audit team continued their work in the conference room, occasionally emerging to speak with other staff members or examine specific areas of the office. As 5 o'clock approached, Sarah began her usual end-of-day routine while remaining alert to any unusual activity around the audit team's workspace. She noticed that Director Wells and her colleagues appeared to be packing substantial amounts of documentation, suggesting their on-site review was nearing completion. During the elevator ride to the parking garage, Sarah found herself sharing the space with one of the male auditors who had been present during her interview. He nodded politely, but remained silent until they reached the garage level. Ms. Martinez, he said as the elevator doors opened. I hope our presence here hasn't been too disruptive to your work routine. Not at all, Sarah replied. I understand these reviews are necessary for compliance purposes. The man smiled briefly before heading toward a dark sedan parked near the garage entrance. Sarah walked in the opposite direction toward her own vehicle, conscious that her movements were likely being observed despite the casual nature of the elevator conversation. The drive home provided an opportunity for Sarah to decompress and analyze the day's events. The interview had been conducted professionally, and her responses had been well received without generating any obvious red flags. However, the auditor's comment in the elevator suggested the team's interest in her might extend beyond routine personnel verification. That evening, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror and slowly rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the intricate tattoo that she had kept hidden for 3 years. The symbols seemed more vivid than usual in the soft lighting, each line and curve representing decisions and experiences that had shaped her in ways she rarely allowed herself to remember. The unit symbol near her shoulder caught her attention as it always did during these private moments. The geometric design was beautiful in its complexity, but its true significance lay in what it represented about her former life and the people who had shared those dangerous years with her. Sarah traced the outline of the symbol with her fingertip, wondering if anyone from her past had noticed her name on whatever background check databases the audit team was consulting. The possibility seemed remote given the thoroughness of her identity transition, but absolute certainty was impossible when dealing with government agencies that specialized in uncovering hidden information. Rolling her sleeve back down, Sarah completed her evening routine while contemplating the careful balance she had maintained for 3 years. The tattoo would remain concealed beneath professional attire, and her past would continue to stay buried in classified files that few people could access. However, the events of the week had reminded her that the boundary between her current life and her former existence was more fragile than she sometimes allowed herself to believe. The audit would conclude, the team would submit their reports, and Henderson and Associates would likely receive whatever security clearances were required for their government contract. Sarah had survived the scrutiny without compromising her cover, but the experience served as a reminder that her carefully constructed anonymity required constant vigilance to maintain. The tattoo beneath her sleeve represented not just her past, but also the ongoing need to balance the person she had been with the person she had chosen to become. Monday morning brought an unsettling development that shattered Sarah's weekend sense of security. As she settled into her cubicle with her usual coffee and checked her email, she discovered a message that made her blood run cold. The subject line was innocuous enough: follow-up meeting, security review. But the sender's name stopped her breath entirely. Marcus Chun, not the Tom Chin from IT, but someone whose name she recognized from a life she thought she had left completely behind. Sarah stared at the screen for several seconds, her mind racing through possibilities and implications. Marcus Chun had been her handler during the final 2 years of her intelligence career, the man who had coordinated her most sensitive assignments and eventually approved her extraction from active service. If he was somehow connected to this audit, it meant her carefully constructed cover had been compromised in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The email requested her presence in the conference room at 10 o'clock for an additional discussion regarding her background verification. The tone was professional, but carried an underlying urgency that suggested this was not optional. Sarah printed the message and immediately deleted it from her inbox, old habits reasserting themselves as she contemplated what Marcus's presence might mean. She had 90 minutes to prepare for a conversation that could determine whether she would be able to maintain her current life or whether she would need to disappear again. The prospect of abandoning everything she had built at Henderson and Associates filled her with a profound sadness she hadn't expected. Despite its limitations, this quiet existence had provided something her previous life never offered: genuine peace. Sarah spent the next hour reviewing her options while mechanically processing financial reports that suddenly seemed irrelevant. She could attempt to maintain her cover identity and hope Marcus would respect her decision to leave the intelligence world behind. Alternatively, she could acknowledge their shared history and try to negotiate some arrangement that would protect her current life while addressing whatever concerns had brought him here. The third option, immediate flight, remained available, but would require abandoning not just her job, but also the entire identity she had spent 3 years building. Sarah had prepared for that possibility, maintaining emergency funds and documentation that would allow her to disappear within hours if necessary. However, the emotional cost of starting over again felt almost overwhelming. At 5 minutes before 10, Sarah made her way to the conference room, her steps measured and controlled despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. She had chosen her outfit carefully that morning, ensuring her long sleeves provided complete coverage while projecting professional competence. The tattoo beneath the fabric felt like a weight that had grown heavier overnight. Marcus was alone in the conference room when she arrived. His appearance subtly changed from their last meeting 7 years earlier. His hair had acquired silver streaks that made him look distinguished rather than old, and his suit was more expensive than the practical clothing he had worn during their operational years. However, his eyes retained the same sharp intelligence that had made him such an effective coordinator of complex international operations. "Hello, Sarah," he said as she entered, his voice carrying the familiar tone of professional warmth that had characterized their working relationship. "Thank you for meeting with me." "I wasn't aware I had a choice," Sarah replied, taking a seat across from him while maintaining the composed demeanor she had perfected during her 3 years at Henderson and Associates. Marcus smiled slightly, acknowledging the validity of her observation. "You always have choices, Sarah. That's something I've always respected about you, even when your decisions complicated my operational planning." The reference to their shared history hung in the air between them, confirming what Sarah had suspected since reading his name in the email. Her cover had been compromised, though the extent and implications of that compromise remained unclear. "What do you want, Marcus?" Sarah asked directly, abandoning the pretense that this was a routine security interview. "First, let me say that your transition to civilian life has been impressive," Marcus replied, consulting a folder that was considerably thicker than the one Director Wells had used during Friday's interview. 3 years of steady employment, no security incidents, No attempts to contact former associates or access classified information. You've become exactly what you claimed you wanted to be during our exit interviews. Sarah remained silent, waiting for him to reveal the true purpose of his presence. Marcus had always been skilled at providing context before delivering difficult information, a technique that had served him well when briefing operatives about dangerous assignments. The problem, Marcus continued, is that circumstances have changed in ways that affect your ability to maintain your current lifestyle. A situation has developed that requires someone with your specific skill set and operational background. I'm retired, Sarah said firmly. Whatever situation you're dealing with, you'll need to find another solution. Marcus nodded as if he had expected that response. I understand your position, and I want to be clear that this isn't a standard reactivation request. The situation involves someone you worked with during your final assignment, and your unique knowledge of that operation makes you the only person who can provide the assistance we need. The mention of her final assignment caused Sarah's hand to move unconsciously toward her left arm, a gesture that Marcus noticed immediately. His eyes followed the movement with the trained observation skills that had made him effective in his current position. Prague, Marcus said quietly. Operation Nightfall. You remember. Sarah's composure cracked slightly at the mention of Operation Nightfall, memories flooding back despite her efforts to keep them buried. The assignment had been her most complex and dangerous, involving deep cover infiltration of an international arms trafficking network that had connections to several terrorist organizations. The operation had lasted 18 months and had nearly cost her life on multiple occasions. That operation was concluded successfully 7 years ago, Sarah said, struggling to maintain her professional tone. All objectives were achieved, and all personnel were safely extracted. All except one, Marcus replied, opening his folder to reveal photographs and documents that Sarah recognized from her operational files. David Morrison disappeared during the final phase of Nightfall. He was presumed dead, but recent intelligence suggests he may have been captured and has been held prisoner since then. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. David Morrison had been her partner during Operation Nightfall, the one person she had trusted completely during those dangerous months in Prague. They had worked together with the kind of seamless coordination that only developed between operatives who had learned to depend on each other for survival. More than that, David had been the man she had fallen in love with despite all regulations and professional protocols that prohibited personal relationships between active operatives. Their connection had been one of the primary reasons Sarah had ultimately chosen to leave intelligence work, unable to continue in a career that had cost her the only person who had truly understood the complexities of her life. Where is he? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus slid a photograph across the table. The image showed a man in what appeared to be a prison or detention facility, his face gaunt, but recognizably David despite the years of captivity. Sarah studied the photograph with the trained eye of someone who had learned to extract maximum information from limited visual evidence. The photo was taken 3 weeks ago at a facility in Eastern Europe, Marcus explained. Our sources indicate he's being held by the same organization you were investigating during Nightfall. They've apparently been using him for information about Western intelligence operations. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Relief that David was alive competed with anger at the years she had spent believing him dead, while professional concern about operational security battled with personal desire to help the man she had never stopped loving. Why wasn't I informed earlier that he might have survived? Sarah demanded. Because we had no reliable intelligence suggesting he was alive until very recently, Marcus replied. The organization that captured him has been extremely careful about maintaining operational security. We only learned of his location because of changes in their leadership structure that created opportunities for our current sources. Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing the implications of everything Marcus had told her. David's capture meant that Operation Nightfall had been compromised in ways they had never suspected, and his prolonged detention suggested he had been providing information to his captors for 7 years. What kind of assistance are you requesting? Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Extraction, Marcus said simply. The facility where he's being held is heavily guarded and located in territory where we have limited operational capacity. However, Someone with your knowledge of the original operation and your personal familiarity with David would have the best chance of successfully reaching him. The request was exactly what Sarah had feared and secretly hoped Marcus would make. The rational part of her mind recognized the enormous risks involved in attempting to rescue someone who had been missing for 7 years. David might be too damaged by his captivity to survive an extraction attempt, or his captors might be using him as bait to capture additional Western operatives. However, the emotional part of her mind that had never fully processed David's loss was already calculating possibilities and strategies for reaching him. The skills she had spent 3 years suppressing were reasserting themselves as she mentally reviewed what she knew about Eastern European detention facilities and extraction procedures. "I need to think about this," Sarah said finally. Marcus closed his folder and leaned forward slightly. "I understand this is an enormous request, Sarah. You've built a good life here, and asking you to risk that for an operation with uncertain outcomes isn't something I do lightly." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a secure satellite phone. "This is encrypted and connected to a private network. If you decide to help us, call the number programmed into memory position 1. You have 48 hours to make your decision." After Marcus left, Sarah remained in the conference room for several minutes, staring at the satellite phone and contemplating the choice she faced. Through the window, she could see her colleagues going about their normal workday routines, processing invoices, and attending meetings that seemed suddenly trivial compared to the life and death decision she was now required to make. Returning to her cubicle, Sarah attempted to focus on her assigned tasks while her mind wrestled with competing loyalties and desires. The quiet life she had built at Henderson and Associates represented security and peace, but it had always felt incomplete in ways she had never allowed herself to fully acknowledge. David's survival changed everything. The man she had loved and mourned was alive, suffering in captivity while she processed financial reports in suburban anonymity. The knowledge that she might be the only person capable of saving him created a moral obligation that made her current concerns about maintaining cover seem selfish and insignificant. That evening, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror and slowly rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the tattoo she had kept hidden for 3 years. The symbols seemed to pulse with renewed significance as she contemplated the choice that would determine not just her future, but David's as well. The unit symbol near her shoulder represented not just her past service, but also the bonds of loyalty and sacrifice that connected her to people like David who had risked everything for causes greater than themselves. The geometric design that had once marked her as a member of an elite operational unit now reminded her of obligations that transcended personal comfort and safety. Sarah traced the outline of the symbol with her fingertip, remembering the oath she had taken when she first earned the right to wear it. The commitment to leave no one behind had been more than just words. It had been a sacred promise that defined who she was at her core. Rolling her sleeve back down, Sarah walked to her kitchen table where the satellite phone sat next to her laptop. The device represented a doorway back into a world of danger and complexity she had worked hard to escape. However, it also represented the only opportunity she might ever have to save the man who had given meaning to her previous life. The choice would have to be made by morning, but Sarah already knew what her decision would be. The tattoo beneath her sleeve was more than just a reminder of her past. It was a declaration of values that no amount of suburban tranquility could permanently suppress. David was alive, and that changed everything. Sarah's resignation letter sat on her desk Tuesday morning, a simple document that officially ended her 3-year career at Henderson and Associates. She had crafted it carefully, citing a family emergency that required immediate attention and extended travel. The explanation was vague enough to avoid detailed questions while providing a plausible reason for her sudden departure. Janet Morrison had accepted the resignation with obvious disappointment, but professional understanding. Sarah had built a reputation as a reliable employee, and her sudden decision to leave created both personal regret and practical complications for the accounting department. However, the family emergency explanation discouraged Janet from pressing for details that Sarah couldn't provide. The satellite phone call to Marcus had been brief and decisive. Sarah had simply stated her acceptance of the extraction mission, providing no emotional context or explanation for her decision. Marcus had responded with coordinates for a meeting location and instructions for preparing for immediate deployment to Eastern Europe. Now, as Sarah cleared her personal items from her cubicle, she reflected on the strange circularity that had brought her back to the world she had tried to escape. 3 years of financial reports and office routines had provided a peaceful interlude, but the call to action had reawakened something essential about her identity that suburban anonymity could never fully satisfy. The tattoo beneath her long sleeves seemed to pulse with renewed energy as she prepared to return to operational status. The symbols that had remained hidden for 3 years would soon be revealed to people who understood their significance, marking her return to a community of individuals who lived by codes of loyalty and sacrifice that transcended conventional career considerations. Her colleagues bid her farewell with genuine warmth, several expressing hopes that her family situation would resolve quickly and allow her to return to Henderson and Associates. Sarah accepted their good wishes while knowing she would never see these people again, at least not as the quiet accountant they had known for 3 years. The meeting with Marcus took place in a nondescript office building 40 minutes from her apartment, the kind of facility that intelligence services maintained for briefings that required absolute security. Sarah arrived precisely on time, carrying a small travel bag that contained everything she needed for extended international travel. Marcus was waiting with 2 other operatives she didn't recognize, their presence indicating the seriousness of the extraction mission. Maps, satellite imagery, and technical equipment covered a large table in the center of the room, displaying the kind of detailed operational planning that Sarah remembered from her active service years. The facility is located in a rural area approximately 60 kilometers from the nearest major city, Marcus explained, pointing to aerial photographs that showed a compound surrounded by high walls and guard towers. Our intelligence indicates David is being held in the central building, but we don't have detailed information about internal security measures or guard rotations. Sarah studied the imagery with the trained eye of someone who had planned dozens of similar operations during her intelligence career. The compound appeared to be designed for maximum security, with multiple layers of physical barriers and strategic positioning that would make approach and extraction extremely challenging. What kind of support will be available? Sarah asked, noting the isolated location that would complicate any rescue attempt. Minimal, Marcus replied honestly. This is officially a non-sanctioned operation, which means we can't provide direct military assistance or diplomatic protection if something goes wrong. You'll have communication equipment and emergency extraction coordinates, but you'll be operating essentially alone once you enter the target country. The parameters were exactly what Sarah had expected for a mission involving someone who had been missing for 7 years. Official channels would be reluctant to risk additional personnel for an extraction that might already be too late, leaving unofficial assets like Sarah to attempt operations that had been deemed too dangerous for regular deployment. One of the other operatives, a woman in her 30s with the lean build of someone who maintained constant physical readiness, spread additional documents across the table. We've arranged for equipment and local support through contacts in the region, she explained. Nothing sophisticated, but enough to give you a reasonable chance of reaching the compound and getting out alive. Sarah reviewed the equipment list and logistical support, noting both the capabilities and limitations of what was being offered. The mission would require her to rely heavily on skills she hadn't used in 3 years, operating in hostile territory with minimal backup, and no guarantee that David would be in condition to assist with his own rescue. Time frame? Sarah asked. David's captors are planning to move him to a more secure facility within the next 2 weeks, Marcus replied. Our window for extraction closes after that, assuming we can locate the new detention site at all. The urgency added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous operation. Sarah would need to infiltrate the compound, locate David, and execute an extraction within a narrow time window while operating in unfamiliar territory with limited resources. However, the challenge also reawakened something in Sarah that had been dormant during her 3 years of corporate routine. The combination of tactical planning, physical danger, and high-stakes activated instincts and capabilities she had forgotten she possessed. The quiet accountant persona she had maintained for so long began dissolving as her operational identity reasserted itself. I'll need detailed intelligence about guard procedures and facility layout, Sarah said, her voice taking on the crisp professional tone she had used during mission briefings in her previous life. Everything we have is in this folder, the second operative replied, handing her a thick packet of documents and photographs. It's not complete, but it's the best intelligence we've been able to gather about current operations. Sarah spent the next 2 hours reviewing every available piece of information about the detention facility, David's suspected location within the compound, and the opposition forces she would face during the extraction attempt. The briefing process felt familiar despite the years that had passed, her mind automatically organizing tactical details and identifying potential complications. As the meeting concluded, Marcus walked her to the building's exit, his expression reflecting both professional confidence and personal concern. Sarah, I want you to know that if you change your mind about this mission, no one would question that decision. What you're attempting is extremely dangerous, and the chances of success are honestly not favorable. David would do the same for me, Sarah replied simply. Actually, he did do the same for me during Operation Nightfall when I was compromised in Prague. I owe him that much. Marcus nodded, understanding the personal obligations that drove operatives to accept missions that conventional risk assessment would classify as suicidal. The extraction coordinates are programmed into your communication device. If you reach them with David, we'll be waiting. If you reach them alone, we'll still be waiting. The flight to Eastern Europe departed that evening, providing Sarah with several hours to mentally prepare for the transition from suburban accountant to active intelligence operative. She had exchanged her conservative business attire for practical clothing suitable for extended physical activity and potential combat situations. More significantly, she had finally revealed the tattoo that had remained hidden for 3 years. The intricate sleeve design emerged from beneath rolled-up fabric as she prepared for a mission that would require all the skills and identity those symbols represented. The unit designation near her shoulder seemed particularly vivid in the aircraft's dim lighting. The geometric pattern that had once marked her as a member of an elite operational team, now serving as a reminder of capabilities she was about to test against extremely dangerous opposition. During the long flight, Sarah reviewed the mission parameters repeatedly while allowing her mind to shift fully back into operational mode. The careful emotional control she had maintained during her civilian years gave way to the focused intensity that had characterized her intelligence career. Landing in a small airport that served as cover for intelligence operations, Sarah was met by a local contact who provided final equipment and transportation to the staging area. The man spoke little English and asked no questions about her mission, reflecting the professional discretion that characterized effective support networks. The safe house was located in a rural area within striking distance of the detention facility, equipped with basic communications equipment and a small cache of weapons and tactical gear. Sarah spent her first night reviewing the compound layout one final time while preparing the equipment she would need for infiltration and extraction. The tattoo on her left arm seemed to come alive in the operational environment, each symbol representing skills and experiences that were about to be tested under life and death conditions. The quiet accountant who had processed financial reports for 3 years was completely gone, replaced by the intelligence operative who had once earned the right to wear those permanent marks of service and capability. 24 hours later, Sarah lay prone on a hillside overlooking the detention compound, studying guard patterns through night vision equipment while calculating approach routes and extraction possibilities. David was somewhere in the central building, possibly less than 100 meters from her current position, but separated by multiple layers of security and armed opposition. The mission that would determine both their futures was about to begin, and Sarah felt the familiar mixture of fear and exhilaration that accompanied high-stakes operations. The tattoo beneath her tactical gear represented not just her past service, but also the commitment to loyalty and sacrifice that had brought her back to this dangerous world. 3 years of hiding were about to end in a few hours of action that would either reunite her with the man she had never stopped loving or cost both of them their lives. Sarah checked her equipment one final time, said a silent prayer to whatever forces governed the fate of people who chose duty over safety, and began her approach to the compound. The hidden symbols on her arm would soon be revealed to people who understood their true meaning, marking the end of her civilian disguise and the beginning of the most important mission of her career. David was waiting somewhere in the darkness ahead, and Sarah was finally coming to bring him home.